Hey y'all, I'm Paul Bonzer and I'm back out at the shop with another project. Today I'm going to show you how I put together this shaving horse.
The shaving horse I built is actually referred to as a shaving mule in the plans, and was designed, at least partially, by Brian Boggs, Tom Dehaney, and Drew Langsner. I'll include a link in the description to the page where you can download the plan PDF for free, as well as a link to an article on Popular Woodworking's website which has some more detailed instructions and photos. The plan called for some unusually long bolts which I was unable to find easily, so I just cut some threaded rod to length and used a washer and nut on either side. Most of the wood parts were cut from a single 10-foot 2x10. The first step was cross-cutting the big board into smaller chunks. I used a circular saw with a guide rail to make these cuts since my chop saw can't quite cut a 2x10 in a single cut. While I picked the best board available, there was still some tension in the board, and it pinched the saw blade partway through one of the cuts. The blade was fine, and I was able to flip the board over and finish the cut. Next up were some rip cuts, which I did on my table saw. The first two cuts were stopped cuts on what would become the rails. Next, I ripped a piece that would become the rear legs and rear leg spacer. Then I ripped a piece in half to make the levers. Finally, I ripped the pieces for the ratchet, treadle support, and front leg. During the first of these cuts, the board bowed again, this time pinching the riving knife. I probably should have lowered the blade and made the cut in 2 passes, but I was able to finish the cut by flipping the board end over end and cutting the rest of the way through. After I was done on the table saw, I cross-cut the pieces for the levers. After that, I marked the curves on the rails and used a jigsaw to cut them out. To finish the rails, I screwed the 2 pieces together and then cut the angles on both ends. Since these don't need to be super precise, I took the opportunity to practice cutting with the handsaw rather than using a chop saw. I also cut matching angles on the front leg, using the angles on the rails as a guide so they would match. I marked out all the drill locations, drilled as far as possible with the pieces still screwed together, then separated the pieces to finish the holes in the second rail. Supporting both rails while drilling was quite an arm workout. The back legs required a compound angle of 15 degrees in both directions, so I set the miter angle and tilt of my chop saw to 15 degrees for the cuts. The Popular Woodworking article does a good job of explaining the saw setup for this cut. I would definitely recommend using that as a guide alongside the plan PDF, since that's a bit more terse in its explanations. Even though I was rushing because it was starting to rain, I managed to get the cuts right on the first try. Next up was cutting the wedges from the tops of the rear legs. I screwed up my first go at marking the lines, but figured it out before doing any actual cuts. After that, it was just a matter of following the lines on the bandsaw. It was a little difficult to see since the pieces were just under the height limit for my bandsaw. The result was a little rough, but good enough for a piece of shop equipment. To hold the pieces in place while the glue dried, I used some short screws. To drill the holes in the front leg, I clamped it in place on one of the rails, then used a drill to transfer the hole locations. My drill bit wasn't long enough to go through 2 boards, so I had to separate the boards to finish drilling. I cut the rear leg spacer to size, then used the same technique to transfer the hole locations to the rear spacer and rear legs. With the leg pieces all done, I could attach the legs to the rails. It was just a matter of sandwiching the pieces together, inserting the pieces of threaded rod, and adding the nuts and washers. The holes were a little tight, so it took a little persuasion, but everything went together eventually. Next was the backup. As the name implies, this is the part that goes behind and supports the adjustable portion of the shaving horse. It also has a hole which holds the fulcrum bolt for the levers. I cut the longer centerpiece and matched the angle on that for the 2 smaller pieces which support it on the sides. I glued and screwed the side pieces into place. After one of the pieces started to crack, I pre-drilled the rest of the holes before adding the screws. Once all the screws were in place, I marked and drilled the fulcrum hole through, starting on the drill press and finishing with a longer bit in a handheld drill. After the glue was dry, I lined up the backup with its holes in the rails, marked their positions, and drilled the matching holes. I attached the backup by driving dowels through the holes and trimming them flush with a flush cut saw. The dowels were quite a tight fit, so everything is held pretty securely in place. I cut the pivot on the bandsaw and drilled it on the drill press. I widened the pivot hole a little bit with a rat tail file to allow it to turn freely on the dowel, which will hold it in place. I drove a dowel through the rails and pivot and trimmed it flush. The original plans call for using a piece of elastic cord, but I had some springs handy, so I used one of those instead. I used a screw to attach the spring to the bottom corner of the pivot, and then another to attach the other end to the bottom of one of the rails. I marked the hole and notch locations on the levers. I drilled the holes, starting with one lever on the drill press, and then transferring the holes to the other lever to ensure they would be lined up. I then cut the notches from the bottom corners of the levers and rounded over their top edges on the bandsaw. I pre-drilled the cross piece that goes between the levers, then drilled through the levers and bolted the pieces together. I made the treadle from a piece of scrap plywood. I transferred the measurements from the levers and then cut it to shape on the bandsaw. I cut a couple of extra pieces of plywood to use as support blocks to help hold the treadle in place. I attached the support blocks and treadle and attached the levers to the backup to test. I realized I needed to notch the back of the treadle so it wouldn't run into the front leg. I marked the location of the notch and cut it out on the bandsaw. After that, it was able to swing all the way forward without hitting the floor or running into the front leg. The rotating jaw was cut from one of the pieces of the board with the straightest and tightest grain. I didn't have any good way of holding the piece vertically on my drill press table, so I used a drill chuck and 4-jaw chuck on my lathe to drill the hole needed. The Forstner bit I was using leaves a nice clean hole, but wasn't long enough to drill all the way through, so I had to flip the piece around to finish the hole. I took my time making sure the piece was straight in the chuck after flipping, so the final hole was fairly straight. There was a bit of a ridge left in the middle, but I was able to clean it out by using the threaded rod as a makeshift file. The block needed washers on both sides of the levers, so I used a piece of masking tape to dangle the second inside washer into position while pushing the threaded rod through. The seat was made from a bit of 1/2-inch scrap plywood. I marked it out using a compass and a square and cut the shape out on the bandsaw. I then pre-drilled and screwed a cleat to the bottom to hold it between the rails. The ratchet was similar to the backup in construction, with a longer central piece and 2 cheeks which attached to the sides. I cut these pieces out on the bandsaw. Then I marked the ratchet teeth and cut them out as well. I did a quick test to make sure the teeth engaged properly with the pivot. Then I pre-drilled, glued, and screwed the ratchet cheeks on. I made the work support, which acts as the lower jaw, from some scrap 3/4-inch plywood. I cut a strip to the correct width, then cut 2 pieces out of that strip to shape. In one of the pieces, I routed a V-groove down the center. To make sure the work support would sit flush, I sanded the top of the ratchet flat. Then, I pre-drilled, glued, and screwed the bottom support layer to the top of the ratchet. I pre-drilled from the bottom, glued, and screwed the bottom support layer up into the top support layer so there would be no screw heads on the top where they might come into contact with tools being used on the shaving horse later. There was a void in the plywood that was exposed when I cut it to shape, so I cut out a shim and glued it into the gap to fill it in. Once the glue was all dry, I used a flush trim saw to cut off the excess shim. Then I was ready for a quick first test of the shaving bench. I moved the whole thing outside onto some sawhorses to sand it. I was originally planning on removing the legs to do the sanding, but since it had been such a tight fit, I decided I'd leave it mostly assembled instead. I wasn't going for a particularly fine finish, so I mostly focused on easing any sharp corners and smoothing any areas that might otherwise be prone to leaving splinters in hands or legs. I sanded up through 220 grit, though I spent less time than I normally would for most projects on the higher grits. Since I was outside, I took advantage of a quicker method of cleaning the dust off after sanding. For a finish, I made a mixture of about 1 part brush-on polyurethane, 1 part boiled linseed oil, and 2 parts mineral spirits. I wiped the finish on with a rag, and then left it for a bit to soak in and dry. Once it was mostly dry, I came back and wiped off any excess with a dry rag. At some point later, I'll probably apply another coat or two, but for now, that's it. To use a shaving horse, or shaving mule in this case, is pretty simple. You sit down, adjust the lower support, slide your workpiece in, then press forward on the treadle to clamp the upper jaw down and hold your workpiece in place. You can then use a draw knife to debark and rough shape a piece, or a spoke shave to refine it. Repositioning the piece is as easy as releasing tension with your foot, turning the piece to the new position. Thanks for watching. I hope you found this video useful. I'll catch y'all next time.